The morning Samuel Malone drove the last fence post into the cracked Oklahoma earth, he knew in his bones that the land had already beaten him, and still he hammered that post with everything he had left, because a man does not quit while there is still breath in his chest, even if his heart has long since gone hollow. It was the spring of 1889, 2 years after he had filed his claim on 160 acres of the Cherokee Strip's southern edge. 2 years after he had arrived in the Oklahoma Territory with a wagon loaded with tools, a mule named Cedar, a milk cow he called Ruth, and a dream so large it barely fit inside his ribcage. The dream was simple the way most important things are simple. He wanted soil beneath his boots that belonged to him and no one else. He wanted wheat in the ground come autumn and bread on a table he had built with his own hands. He wanted the particular quiet of a place where no landlord could come to the door and no foreman could shout across a field that did not belong to the man who worked it. Samuel Malone had grown up sharecropping in eastern Tennessee with a father who bent his back over another man's cotton until the bending became permanent, and Samuel had sworn at 15 years old, kneeling beside his father's grave in a field that was not theirs, that he would one day own something true. He was 34 years old now, and the dream had been slowly turning to ash for 18 months. The first winter had taken Ruth the cow before Christmas. A cold snap that came without warning dropped the temperature so fast, and so hard that 3 of his 4 chickens froze in the coop before he woke to find them. He ate one and gave the other 2 decent burials because there was something wrong about leaving even a chicken stiff and abandoned in the dirt. And that impulse toward decency was one of the things that made Samuel Malone both a good man and a struggling homesteader. A harder man might have managed better. The second winter had been dry, which sounds like mercy but is not, because dry winter means dry spring, and dry spring means the wheat he planted in November came up sparse and yellow and gave him barely enough to cover the seed cost. The summer that followed was a furnace. His well dropped 4 feet. Cedar the mule developed a hitch in his right foreleg that made plowing the south field an exercise in grief. And then in September, a grasshopper swarm came down from the north like a brown living curtain and ate what little he had growing in the kitchen garden, stripped the bark from his 2 young cottonwood saplings, and moved on without a backward glance, indifferent as weather, because that is what the Oklahoma Territory was. It was indifferent. It did not hate Samuel Malone. It simply did not care about him at all, and sometimes that is worse than hatred, because hatred at least acknowledges your existence. Now it was March of 1889, just before the great land run that everyone in the territory was talking about, and Samuel stood beside that fence post and looked out across his 160 acres and saw a man's best years spread thin across yellow grass and cracked clay. His hands were calloused past feeling. His face had been weathered into something older than 34. He had $14 in a tobacco tin under the floorboard. He had enough flour for 2 weeks and enough salt pork for 1. Cedar was managing, but barely. And the south field, the field he had planned to put into winter wheat the following autumn, the field that was supposed to be the foundation of everything, sat unplanted because he did not have enough seed grain to fill it. He had written to his brother Thomas in Memphis about a loan, and Thomas had written back 4 weeks later with genuine sorrow and no money, because Thomas had 4 children and a leaking roof, and could not spare what he did not have. He had gone into Guthrie and spoken with the man at the land office, who had been sympathetic in the bureaucratic way of men who are sympathetic while doing nothing. He had spoken with Harlan Creek, the merchant in the small settlement 3 miles east called Duster's Ford, and Harlan had looked at his account and shaken his head, and said he could extend credit no further without collateral, and the only collateral Samuel had was the land itself and the claim that attached to it. He had sat down the evening before on the front step of his 1-room cabin and watched the sun go down over the territory and thought about giving up. Not dramatically. Not with despair roaring through him like a river. Just quietly, the way a candle considers going out when the wax is nearly gone. He had thought about walking away from the claim, which a man could do, which many men had done, which the territory was full of evidence of in the form of abandoned cabins and fence posts standing sentinel over nothing. He had thought about going to Guthrie and catching the Santa Fe south to Texas and hiring on as a ranch hand somewhere, which was not a bad life, which many men lived contentedly, but which was not his dream, and he had promised his father, kneeling in that field in eastern Tennessee, that he would not spend his life in another man's field. He had sat there until the stars came out and made their cold promises overhead, and then he had gone inside and lain down on his cot and stared at the ceiling and decided, with the stubborn irrationality of a man who cannot help what he is, that he would plant the south field in the spring if he could get seed grain from somewhere, and if he could not get seed grain, he would plant the north field again with what little he had, and if the rains came, he would be all right, and if they did not, well, he would decide what to do about that then. He was not a man given to elaborate planning. He was a man given to persistence, which is a different thing and sometimes more useful and sometimes less. And so he drove that last fence post in at dawn, and the hammer blow rang out across the flat Oklahoma land, and Cedar looked up from the sparse grass he was grazing and flicked one ear in acknowledgement, and Samuel stood back and looked at what he had built and felt the particular loneliness of a man who has no one to show his work to. He heard the wagon before he saw it. The sound came from the east, from the direction of Duster's Ford, and it was the sound of a wagon moving with purpose rather than meandering, the crack and roll of wheels on hard ground, the steady clip of hooves that knew where they were going. Samuel shaded his eyes against the rising sun, which was just cresting the flat horizon in a blaze of orange and rose that made the prairie briefly beautiful, and he watched the wagon come down the trace road that ran along the northern edge of his claim. It was a woman driving. He could see that much at a distance. A figure in a dark dress sitting straight-spined on the wagon seat with the reins held properly in two hands, not slack the way an inexperienced driver holds them, but taut with the easy authority of someone who had been handling horses for a long time. There was a broad-brimmed hat against the sun. There were two horses pulling, which was more horse than most single homesteaders could afford, which told him something. The wagon bed was loaded with something. He could not see what from this distance. He watched the wagon turn off the trace road and come down his access lane, which was not much of a lane, just two wheel ruts in the grass that he had worn over 2 years of going back and forth to Duster's Ford, and he stood beside his fence, post with the hammer still in his hand, and watched the wagon come to a stop 20 feet from where he stood. The woman set the brake and climbed down from the seat without waiting for assistance, which was not unusual on the frontier where waiting for assistance was a luxury most people could not afford, and she landed in the dust of his yard with a solid, decisive step and looked at him straight on. She was perhaps 30 or 31, though the Oklahoma sun made ages difficult to read with precision. She was of medium height and lean in the way of people who work hard and do not have excess, and she had dark brown hair pulled back under that broad-brimmed hat, and her eyes were a gray-green that reminded Samuel of river water in late summer. Her dress was practical and well-made, but not new. The dark blue of it faded to something quieter from many washings. Her face was composed and serious and not unkind, and she looked at Samuel Malone with the directness of a woman who has already spent her quota of indirectness and cannot spare any more. "You are the man with the south field," she said. It was not a question. Samuel blinked. "I am," he said. "Samuel Malone, this is my claim." "Olive Langley," she said. She did not offer her hand, which was the convention of the time, but she held his gaze with the same authority with which she had held those reins. "I filed a claim 8 months ago on the parcel east of you, the one that runs along the creek." Samuel knew the parcel. He had walked its boundary once in the early days when he was still exploring the country around him. Good land, actually. Better than his in some respects because the creek gave it water access that his own claim lacked, though the creek ran low in summer and had been nearly dry last August. "I know it," he said. "Good land." "It will be," she said. "My husband filed it. He died in November." The words were factual and unadorned, the way she seemed to say everything, but Samuel heard what was underneath them, which was a grief carried so long and so constantly that it had become simply part of the weight a person moves with, like the weight of the body itself. "I am sorry," he said, and meant it. "Thank you," she said. "I have been managing through the winter. I have 2 hired men, brothers, the Pickett brothers from Guthrie. They have been helping me work the claim since my husband passed. But they are leaving next week to go in on the land run, which I cannot fault them for." She glanced at the wagon bed. "Before they go, they help me haul this." Samuel looked at the wagon bed for the first time with real attention, and he felt something move strangely in his chest, something that was not quite hope and not quite disbelief, but lived in the territory between them. The wagon was loaded with seed grain, not a modest amount, a serious amount. 2 bushel sacks of winter wheat seed lined up in the wagon bed. He counted 8 of them, more than enough to plant the south field and perhaps put some into the north field as well. He looked back at Olive Langley. "That's a lot of seed grain," he said carefully. "It is," she said. "I bought it last autumn before my husband died when we were planning for the spring planting. I cannot plant all of it. My claim is good land, but it is not all arable, and I do not have the labor now that the Pickett brothers are going. I need someone to plant it and tend it, and I need to be able to keep a share of the harvest." She looked at him without blinking. "Harlan Creek told me you have the south field and no seed to put in it." Samuel felt a slow flush of something that was not quite embarrassment, though it was adjacent to it. Harlan Creek had no business discussing Samuel's affairs with a neighbor, and at the same time he was aware that in the territory, business was often everyone's business, and that information was a kind of currency that moved as freely as gossip, and that the end result of Harlan Creek talking too much might be standing in front of him in the form of a wagon full of seed grain and a woman with river water eyes. "He should not have said that," Samuel said. "He said it because I asked him," Olive said. "I was looking for someone with land and no seed. You are someone with land and no seed. This seemed like an arrangement that could work for both of us." She glanced at the south field, which was visible beyond the fence. "That field looks workable." "It is," Samuel said. "Good clay loam. I had it turned last fall. It just needs breaking up again and seed." "Then here is what I propose," Olive Langley said. And there was something so direct and businesslike about the way she said it that Samuel almost smiled, because there was something bracing and unexpectedly refreshing about a woman who showed up at dawn with a wagon full of seed grain and got straight to the point. "You plant this grain in your south field. I will provide the seed. You provide the labor and the land. At harvest, we split the crop, 60 to you, 40 to me. I need the 40 because I have to buy seed for my own fields next year, and I need the cash or the grain from the sale to do it. You need the 60 because you need to eat through the winter and have something to sell." She paused. "Those are my terms. You may think on them." Samuel thought on them for approximately 4 seconds. "Those are fair terms," he said. "Better than fair, actually." "They are fair," she agreed. "Not charity. I want to be clear about that. This is a business arrangement." "I understand," he said. There was a brief pause in which the morning air moved softly between them and Cedar. The mule walked over from the far side of the yard to investigate the newcomers with the mild curiosity of a creature who has seen enough of the world to be unsurprised by most of it. And one of Olive's horses turned its head to regard Cedar with equal equanimity. And the whole scene had a strange quality of rightness that Samuel Malone would not have been able to articulate if asked, but which registered in him like a chord struck true. "I will need to move the grain," he said, "into the barn until I can get the field ready. The Pickett brothers are behind me by half an hour with another load," Olive said. "They can help unload before they go." "Then come inside," Samuel said, because manners cost nothing. I can make coffee." Olive Langley looked at the cabin with the appraising eye of a woman who has built and maintained her own dwelling under difficult conditions. And whatever she saw in it, she did not say, only followed him inside with that same composed and self-contained manner that he was already, after 10 minutes of acquaintance, beginning to recognize as the particular signature of who she was. The cabin was one room 12 feet by 14, with a plank floor he had laid himself with wood hauled from Guthrie, a cast-iron stove in the corner, a cot along one wall, a table and 2 chairs, and a row of shelves he had made from cottonwood planks that held his sparse collection of goods. It was clean. Samuel Malone was a tidy man by nature, which was another of those qualities that made him a decent human being and an occasionally impractical homesteader, because time spent keeping things orderly was time not spent on the 1,000 other things that needed doing. Olive sat in one of his chairs and did not look around the room with intrusive curiosity, only glanced at it the way one glances at a landscape, taking in what is there without judgment, and waited while he filled the coffee pot from the water bucket and set it on the stove. "How long have you been on the claim?" she asked. 2 years come April," he said. "From Tennessee originally." "Iowa," she said. "We came out 2 years ago as well. My husband Robert had the same idea as everyone else. Own something. He was from Iowa, born there, we both were. We married in 1882. He was a good man." She said this without sentimentality, as a simple established fact, the way one would say the sky is blue. He was not strong, though. His lungs had always been a trouble. The winters here, the cold and the wind. He went fast when he went. "I am sorry," Samuel said again, and again meant it. Olive looked at him. "You said that already." "It bears saying twice," he said. Something shifted very slightly in her expression, not quite a smile, but a softening like ice that is considering spring. It was gone in a moment and she was composed again, but Samuel had seen it, and it stayed with him. The Pickett brothers arrived exactly when she had said they would. 2 broad-shouldered young men with identical red hair and identical easy grins, who unloaded the grain sacks into Samuel's small barn with cheerful efficiency, and were back on their wagon and headed toward Guthrie, and the land run with handshakes all around before the coffee was properly done. There was something almost festive about them, the energy of men at the beginning of something, and Samuel watched them go with a feeling he could not quite name, something that was not envy exactly but was the shadow envy makes. Olive drank her coffee standing at the door of the cabin, looking out over the yard and the field beyond, and when she finished, she handed him the tin cup and said, "I will come back on Thursday to see how the field preparation is going," and climbed onto her wagon and drove east toward her own claim with the same purposeful economy with which she had arrived. Samuel stood in the doorway of his cabin for a long moment after the wagon disappeared, holding 2 empty coffee cups, and thought that the morning had turned out considerably different than he had expected. He began preparing the south field the next day. It was hard work even with Cedar's help, breaking up the winter-packed clay and turning it over in long, straight rows, and Cedar's leg was still not entirely right. So Samuel worked slowly and steadily, and did not push the mule past what was comfortable, which meant the field went slower than he would have liked, but at a pace that would not lame his only working animal. He worked from first light to the last of the light, stopping at midday to eat a cold biscuit and drink water from the canteen he kept tied to the plow handle, and when he came in each evening he was so tired that thought itself was an effort. But it was a good tired, the kind that comes from doing something that has purpose and direction. He had not felt purposeful in many months, and the feeling was like circulation returning to a numb limb, slightly painful and entirely welcome. He thought about Olive Langley while he worked, the way the mind naturally turns over the nearest interesting thing when the body is occupied with something rhythmic and repetitive. He thought about the directness of her, the way she had stood in front of him without apology and laid out her terms as if there was nothing unusual about a widow showing up at a stranger's homestead at dawn, with a wagon load of seed grain and a business proposition. He supposed that in the Oklahoma Territory there was nothing unusual about it, because the territory was young enough that the usual rules had not fully hardened yet, and women out here did things out of necessity that no one in Iowa or Tennessee would have thought proper or possible, and sometimes necessity made people more themselves rather than less, burned away the unnecessary and left something truer and harder and more interesting. He thought about her husband Robert, whose lungs had betrayed him in the Oklahoma winter, and he thought about what it meant to come out to the territory with a dream and watch it die not in your own hands but in someone else's, in the person you had brought with you into the hard country. He thought that might be worse than the dream dying in your own hands, because at least when it died in your own hands, you knew exactly what happened and could measure exactly what it cost. Thursday came. He was in the south field when he heard her wagon on the trace road, and he straightened from behind the plow and watched her come down the access lane and pull the team up at the edge of the field. She climbed down and walked to the field's edge and looked out over what he had done, which was most of the northern half of the field turned over in neat dark rows, the soil broken fine the way wheat seed likes it. "Good work," she said. "Thank you," he said. "Cedar's leg is giving him some trouble, so we're going a bit slower than I'd like." She frowned slightly, not at Samuel, at the problem. "Which leg?" "Right foreleg. He's been carrying a hitch in it since last fall." "May I look at him?" Samuel blinked. "You know horses." "I know mules," she said, in a tone that suggested the distinction was minor and the knowledge was genuine. They went to where Cedar was standing in the shade of the barn, and Olive crouched down without hesitation and ran her hands along Cedar's right foreleg with a practiced, confident touch, and Cedar, who was generally suspicious of strangers, stood patiently under her hands with his ears at a relaxed angle. "There," she said, and pressed gently at a point just above the knee. "Feel that." Samuel crouched beside her, and she guided his hand to the same spot, and he felt the subtle heat and swelling there that he had somehow missed in his own examinations, though he was not sure how he had missed it. "Soft tissue," she said. "It's been inflamed for a while. He needs rest, and you need to pack that joint with cold mud twice a day for a week. After that, he can go back to light work." She stood. "Do you have liniment?" "I have some," he said. "Half a bottle. I have more at home. I'll bring it next time." She glanced back at the field. "Can you borrow a horse in the meantime, to finish the field?" "Maybe from the Hendersons," he said, thinking of the family 3 miles to the north who had 2 draft horses and a general policy of neighborly cooperation. "Earl Henderson is a good neighbor. Ask him," she said. "The seed should go in within the next 2 weeks if we want it to have a real chance." "I know," he said. He hesitated. "Do you want to see the rest of the claim? The north field came through the winter better than I expected." She looked at him for a moment with those river water eyes, and he was aware that this was slightly different territory than seed grain and mule legs, slightly more personal, an invitation to see what he had built, and he was not entirely sure why he had issued it except that he wanted her to see it, which was a want he did not examine too closely. "All right," she said. They walked the north field, which was indeed in decent shape, and the kitchen garden plot, which was bare and waiting, and the small orchard he had started with 3 apple saplings that had somehow survived 2 winters and were showing their first tentative buds. She walked beside him without hurry, and she asked intelligent questions, the questions of someone who understood land and growing things, and he answered them honestly, including the failures, because he had learned there was no point in presenting the edited version of a homestead to someone who was going to know the truth eventually. "You put the apples on the south-facing slope," she said, looking at the saplings. "Smart." "My mother had an apple tree," he said. "In Tennessee, it always faced south." She looked at him sideways. "Are you sentimental, Mr. Malone?" "About apple trees," he said, "and not much else." She almost smiled again. That almost smile was doing something to him that he was going to have to think about later when he was alone and had the privacy to think clearly. "I should get back," she said. "I have a kitchen garden to turn before the week is out and only myself to do it." "I could come help," he said. When the field here is finished and Cedar is resting." She looked at him, and this time the directness of her gaze had a slightly different quality, assessing rather than simply direct, as if she was measuring something. "That would be fair," she said finally, "given the arrangement." "It is not only because of the arrangement," he said, and then was surprised at himself for saying it, because it was more honest than was strictly necessary, and he was not, as a rule, a man who said more than was necessary. But the Oklahoma air did something to the usual cautions, stripped them away a little the way wind strips dead leaves, and left things cleaner and more exposed. Olive Langley was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, in a tone that might have been agreement and might have been something else entirely. "I suppose it isn't only that." And she walked back to her wagon with that same straight-spined, self-possessed walk, and drove east toward the creek and her own claim. And Samuel Malone stood in the yard of his homestead and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, which was the specific sensation of looking forward to next Thursday. He borrowed Earl Henderson's draft horse, a large gray named Goliath who pulled like a locomotive and required a firm hand, and finished turning the south field in 3 days. He packed Cedar's foreleg in cold mud morning and evening with a consistency that bordered on devotion, and within a week the mule was moving without the hitch, still not right but improving. He went to Olive's claim on the following Tuesday with a borrowed plow still hitched to Goliath, because it seemed wasteful to unhitch and rehitch, and she met him at the gate to her property with that composed expression and a cup of coffee, which was the most welcoming gesture he had seen from her, and which he suspected was not nothing. Her claim was genuinely good land. The creek, even running low as it was in late winter, gave the east pasture a richness that his own land lacked, and she had a kitchen garden plot of impressive ambition, much larger than his own, laid out with evident planning and care. Her cabin was larger than his, a proper 2-room structure with a covered porch, built by her husband in what must have been optimistic early days, and it was well maintained in the way of a woman who takes maintenance seriously. There was a grave beside the east fence. A simple wooden marker, neatly made, with Robert Langley's name and the dates 1851–1888, and a small flat stone at the base that someone, Olive, had kept clear of grass and weeds. Samuel looked at it as he hitched Goliath to her plow and did not say anything, because there was nothing useful to say. But he was aware of it the whole morning while he broke up the kitchen garden plot, and he thought about a woman maintaining a grave alone through an Oklahoma winter, tending that small patch of memory as carefully as she tended everything else, and the thought settled in him like weight. They worked the garden together, she following behind him with the rake to break up the clods he turned, working with an efficiency that suggested she had done this kind of labor beside a partner before, and had not forgotten the rhythm of it even though the partner had changed. When he stopped Goliath to rest at midday, she brought out bread and cold beans and they sat on the porch steps and ate without much talking, and the silence was not uncomfortable. "How did you come to know about mules?" he asked after a while. "My father had a mule business in Cedar Falls," she said. "We bred and traded them. I grew up around them the way you grow up around whatever your family does." "That is a useful thing to have grown up around," he said. "More useful than I expected to need," she said, "though the territory has a way of making everything useful." "It does," he agreed. He looked out toward the creek glinting in the midday sun. "Do you plan to stay on the claim?" She looked at him and the question was in her look before she spoke it. "Why would you ask that?" "I wondered. Some people come out here with a husband's dream and after the husband is gone, they decide to go home. Nobody would fault you for it." "My home is here," she said simply, as if the question had not been difficult at all. "Robert and I came out together and we built something together and I am not leaving it because he is gone. That would be leaving twice and I will not do it." Samuel looked at her. "No," he said, "I do not think you would." They planted the south field the following week, the two of them working side by side with the cedar that Samuel had built from a plan in a farming almanac 2 winters ago, Cedar pulling slowly and carefully with his recovering leg, while Goliath rested in the shade. Olive worked the cedar with complete competence, adjusting the seed flow with a knowledgeable hand, and Samuel guided Cedar along the rows with the patience of a man who has made his peace with slow progress. The April sun was warm on their backs, and the turned earth smelled of possibility, that rich, dark smell that is one of the great honest smells of the world, and Samuel felt something in his chest that had been tight for many months beginning very gradually to ease. "My husband always said planting day was his favorite day," Olive said. She was not sad when she said it. She was simply saying it, the way you say things that are true. "My father said the same," Samuel said. "He said it was because it was the only day when everything was still possible." "Yes," she said, "before the rains and the heat and the insects have had their say." "Before the grasshoppers," he said, with enough feeling that she glanced at him. "They came through here too," she said. "Last September I lost the whole kitchen garden." "I know," he said. "I thought mine was bad, but I imagine two people losing the garden is worse than one." She was quiet for a moment. "It was September," she said. "Robert was already sick by then. He did not really see the grasshoppers. He was inside." She adjusted the cedar. "I did not tell him how bad it was." Samuel thought about that, about the particular loneliness of managing a disaster alone so that someone you loved would not be further distressed. "That was kind of you," he said. "I do not know if it was kind," she said. "It was just what I did." They worked until the afternoon light grew long and golden, and the south field was planted in neat dark rows that held seed like faith holds difficult days, invisible and necessary, and depending on things beyond anyone's control. Samuel unhitched Cedar and brought the mule water and checked the foreleg, which was continuing to improve, and when he looked up, Olive was standing at the edge of the field looking at what they had done. He walked to stand beside her. The field looked the way all planted fields look in the last of the afternoon light, still and full of waiting, the disturbed soil in long curves that repeated out toward the horizon. It was not beautiful in the way that paintings are beautiful, but it was beautiful in the way that useful things done well are beautiful, and Samuel felt the weight in his chest ease another degree. "Thank you," he said, "for the seed, and for this." Olive turned and looked at him, and this time she did not have the composed expression, or rather she had it, but it had something under it that was not so composed, something that was warmer and more vulnerable than the directness she wore like practical clothing. "Do not thank me yet," she said. "Thank me in September if there is something to harvest." "I will thank you now anyway," he said, "for showing up." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly required for a business arrangement, and then she looked back at the field. "I should go," she said, "before the light goes entirely." "I'll follow the trace road to make sure you get home all right," he said. "Cedar needs the walk." She raised an eyebrow at him. "I have been getting home all right for some time, Mr. Malone." "I know that," he said. "But the light is going and the road crosses that low patch by the wash, and it's muddy this time of year. Cedar and I will just ride along to the wash and then turn back." He kept his voice practical, because the thing about Olive Langley was that practical was the language she trusted, and there was nothing dishonest about it either, because the road was muddy and the light was going and those were real things. And also it was simply true that he did not want to stop being in her company yet, and that too was a real thing, and the two real things could coexist without embarrassment. She looked at him for another moment and then she said, "All right," and climbed onto her wagon. He rode Cedar alongside the wagon down the trace road in the falling dusk, and they did not talk much, but the silence was the good kind, the kind that does not need filling, and when they reached the wash, which was muddy but manageable, she crossed it without difficulty and pulled up on the far side and looked back at him. "Good night, Mr. Malone," she said. "Good night, Mrs. Langley," he said. She drove on toward the creek, and he sat on Cedar and watched until the wagon was swallowed by the dusk. And then he turned the mule back toward home and rode through the spring evening with something singing quietly in him that he was not ready to name but could not ignore. May came in green and surprising, because the rains that spring were decent, not extravagant but steady and distributed in a way that the soil could absorb, and the wheat in the south field began to show itself in thin green lines that grew daily more visible. Samuel went to look at it every morning with the ritual attention of a man watching something he has staked himself on, and each morning the green was a little more definite, and he felt a little more like himself. He went to Olive's claim every Tuesday, which had become the established pattern without either of them formally establishing it, and they worked her kitchen garden and her small south field, which she had planted in corn with seed she had saved from the previous year's crop before the grasshoppers came, and they got her 2 horses reshod at the smithy in Duster's Ford, and he fixed the door on her root cellar which had warped over the winter and would not close properly. And she brought him the liniment for Cedar's leg, and a jar of preserved peaches from a batch she had put up last summer, and he ate those peaches over 3 evenings, and they were the best thing he had eaten in a year. He began to look forward to Tuesdays with an anticipation that was frankly unreasonable, and about which he did his best to be reasonable, because he was a practical man, and she was a widow less than 6 months out from her husband's death, and the arrangement between them was a business arrangement, and he was not going to mistake the territory between them for something it was not or project onto her what was not there. And then one Tuesday in the middle of May, he was on her porch fixing a loose board that rattled in the wind, and she came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat in the chair beside where he was working and said, without preamble, because preamble was not her style, "I think of you on days that are not Tuesday." Samuel stopped what he was doing. He held the hammer still and looked at her. Olive was looking at her coffee cup with an expression that suggested this admission had cost her something, not a great deal. She was too self-contained for dramatic confession, but something. The composed expression was still there, but it had gone slightly transparent in a way he had not seen before. "I think of you on days that are not Tuesday as well," he said. She looked up at him then, and the full weight of those river water eyes was on him, and there was something in them that was cautious and honest and real in the way that things are real when they have not been manufactured or projected but have simply occurred, the way the wheat had occurred in the south field, green and unasked for and welcome. "I am not entirely sure what to do with that," she said. "Neither am I," he said honestly. "But I think I would like to figure it out." She was quiet for a long moment. "I was married for 7 years," she said. "Robert was a good man, and I did not expect to find myself in this position again." She paused. "I am not sure I know how to go back to the beginning of things." "I am not sure this is the beginning," he said, and surprised himself again with his own honesty. "It feels more like the middle of something." She looked at him steadily. "The south field," she said. "We planted it together." "We did," he said. "That seems like a beginning," she said. "Maybe it is both," he said. "The middle of knowing each other and the beginning of something else." She considered this with the same thoughtful gravity she applied to everything, and then she said, "You may call me Olive." "Samuel," he said, though she already knew his name, and the exchange was formal and slight, and somehow enormous. A bluebird landed on the porch railing between them and regarded them both with the cheerful indifference of birds, and Olive Langley turned to look at it. And for the first time since Samuel Malone had met her, he saw her smile fully, not the almost smile that came and went in an instant, but a real smile, and it changed her face entirely, made it younger and warmer. And he thought that she was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when you have been looking at them for a while, and one day see them truly. The bluebird flew away. Olive turned back to him, and the smile had subsided to something quieter but had not disappeared entirely. "Finish the board," she said. "It rattles all night." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and picked up the hammer, and he was smiling too. June was good. The wheat in the south field was ankle-high and green gold, and standing straight in the wind, and the corn on Olive's claim was coming in strong, and the kitchen garden was full of the promise of summer vegetables. And Samuel went to Olive's claim on Tuesdays and Thursdays now, because there was always more work, and they had both stopped pretending that the extra Thursday was strictly necessary. He met her neighbors on a Thursday in late June when a man named Cyrus Webb, who had filed on the parcel to the north of her claim, rode down to pay a neighborly call and found Samuel on the porch replacing a window shutter. Cyrus Webb was perhaps 45 and had the leathery face of a man who had spent decades in the sun, and he looked at Samuel with the measuring look of a man establishing what he is seeing. "You must be Malone," Webb said. "I have heard of you." "I expect so," Samuel said. "The territory is not large. Harlan Creek says you have the South Field in good wheat." "I do," Samuel said, "with Mrs. Langley's seed grain." Webb looked from Samuel to Olive, who had appeared in the doorway at the sound of voices. "Mrs. Langley," he said, with the particular politeness that men of his generation applied to widows. "Everything going all right?" "Very well, thank you, Mr. Webb," Olive said. "Mr. Malone has been a considerable help." Webb looked at Samuel again with that measuring look, and there was something in it that was not quite a question and not quite a warning but lived between the two. Samuel met it directly and let it speak for itself, because he was not doing anything wrong and did not intend to begin. And after a moment, Webb's expression settled into something neutral and then almost approving. "Good neighbor," he said to Samuel specifically. "That matters out here." "It does," Samuel agreed. Webb rode on. Olive came out to stand on the porch beside Samuel and they watched him go. "He is looking out for me," Olive said. "He has been since Robert died. He and his wife Martha have been very kind." "He seems like a decent man," Samuel said. "He is," she said. "He will wonder about you." "I imagine so," Samuel said. "Does that concern you?" She looked at him sideways. "Not particularly," she said. "People will wonder regardless. The territory is full of people wondering about each other's business." "And what would you like them to wonder?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "That is not a question I know how to answer yet," she said, which was honest and careful and, he thought, entirely fair. It was on a July evening when the wheat was knee-high, and the heat was the heavy pressing heat of Oklahoma summer, that Samuel Malone first told Olive Langley something personal that was not about the land or the crops or the practical work of homesteading. They were sitting on her porch after the day's work, watching the heat lightning in the distant northwest, and the lightning was silent and spectacular, and the air smelled of warm grass and coming rain, and Samuel said, without entirely planning to, "I had a different life in mind when I was young." "Different from this?" she said. "Different from everything that happened," he said. "I thought about going to school, teacher's college in Knoxville. I had a teacher in Claiborne County who thought I should go." She turned to look at him. "Why didn't you?" "My father got sick when I was 17, he said. "And then he died when I was 18. And there was my mother and my brother Thomas, and I was the oldest, and school was not something that was possible anymore." He paused. "I do not say that with bitterness. It was just how things were, but I thought about it for a long time." "Do you still?" "Not about school," he said. "About learning. About knowing things properly instead of in pieces." He gestured at the fields. "I know something about farming because I had to learn it. I know something about building because I had to, but I know it all sideways from necessity, not from understanding." "That is how most of us know things out here," she said. "I suppose," he said. "But you, for example, you know about mules from growing up around them. That is knowing something true. There is a difference." She was quiet for a moment, considering. "My husband used to say that you could tell the difference between someone who learned a thing and someone who knew a thing," she said. "He thought I knew things the way you described, from really being inside them." "He was right," Samuel said. "He was often right," she said. "He was very intelligent, not in a formal way, just in the way of understanding how things worked." She paused. "I miss that, having someone to think with." "Is that what we do on Tuesdays?" he said. "Think with each other." She looked at him, and the corner of her mouth did the almost smile thing. "Among other things," she said. "What other things?" he asked, and his voice had dropped into a register that was not the business arrangement voice, and they both knew it. Olive looked at him for a long moment in the heat lightning's intermittent light, and her face was doing something complicated and honest, and he waited, because she was a person who deserved to be waited for, and finally she said, "You are making it difficult to be sensible, Samuel." "I am not trying to," he said, "though I am also not trying very hard not to." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, not the polite sound that people make when something is mildly amusing, but a real laugh, brief and genuine and surprised out of her, and it was absolutely the most welcome thing he had heard in years. The sound of it went into him and stayed. "Samuel Malone," she said when the laugh was done, "you are not what I expected when I drove up to your fence post with that grain. What did you expect? A desperate man who would take my terms without thinking." "I did take your terms without thinking," he said. "They were good terms." "You took them in 4 seconds," she said. "I counted. Was that too fast?" "No," she said, and the word was quiet and had more in it than one word usually carries. "No, it was exactly right." The rain came then, not gradually but suddenly, the way Oklahoma summer rain arrives. A wall of cool water that drove them both off the porch and inside, and they stood in her main room listening to it hammer the roof, standing closer than they had stood before, and the lamp on the table made the room amber and warm, and Olive turned to say something and found him looking at her and stopped, and the look that passed between them was not ambiguous and was not business. "I should go," he said, not moving. "The rain," she said, also not moving. "I can ride in rain," he said. "You can," she agreed. "But there is no reason to." He looked at her. "What are you saying?" "I am saying," she said carefully, with the particular care of a woman navigating new country she wants to navigate honestly, "that you should stay until the rain lets up. And I am saying that I would like you to stay. And I am saying that those are both true, and I want you to understand that I am not confused about either of them." "I am not confused about either of them either," he said. "But I want to be careful with you, Olive. I do not want to be something you will regret." "I will not regret you," she said with simple certainty. "I am not saying that carelessly. I have thought about it. That is the kind of person I am." "I know," he said. "It is one of the things He stopped. "Say it," she said. "One of the many things I have come to love about you," he said. He had not intended to use that word so early, and he meant every syllable of it, and he did not take it back. Olive looked at him in the lamplight with the rain crashing on the roof, and her eyes were bright, and the composure was still there, but it was warm now, heated through with something that was alive and present and entirely clear. "I have come to love things about you as well," she said. "Many things." He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood in the lamplight listening to the rain until the rain slowed and then stopped. And when it stopped, they were still standing like that, and neither of them moved to change it, and it was Cedar, waiting patiently outside, who finally reminded Samuel that the evening had moved into night and the mule needed his stall. "I will come Thursday," he said when he had his hat and his coat. "Yes," she said. "You will." He rode home through the washed clean night with every star visible, and the wet grass shining, and Cedar moving with easy confidence in the dark. And Samuel Malone felt more alive than he had felt since he could remember, not the desperate alive of a man fighting something, but the deep alive of a man who has found something worth being alive for. July ripened into August, and the wheat continued its golden progress, and the corn on Olive's claim grew tall and green, and the kitchen garden yielded tomatoes and beans and squash in quantities that fed them both on the days they worked together. And the working together had become something that neither of them called by any particular name, but which had the quality of something permanent and naturally occurring, like the creek or the grass. He kissed her for the first time on an August evening at the edge of the south field, which seemed fitting, and it was not a dramatic kiss but a real one, considered and gentle and mutual. And afterward she put her forehead against his shoulder for a moment in a gesture that was so unguarded and trusting that something in him that had been braced against difficulty for 2 years came loose all at once. "Samuel," she said against his shoulder. Just his name, nothing else, and it was enough. "I know," he said, "I know." He began to take supper with her on Thursdays, and they talked across her table in the lamplight about everything and nothing, about her life in Iowa and his in Tennessee, about her husband's intelligence and his own father's stubbornness, about the territory and what it was and what it might become, about the grasshoppers and the hard winters and the dry summers, and why people stayed despite all of it. Which was a question that answered itself when you sat at a table with lamplight and good food, and someone whose conversation fed you in ways that hay and water did not. He told her about the dream he had almost given up on. He told her about the tobacco tin with $14. He told her about the morning he had driven the last fence post in and felt the defeat of it, the hollow certainty that he had come to the end of what he could do alone. And then you came, he said, with a wagon full of seed grain, she said, and told me to move over, he said, smiling. She raised an eyebrow. I said the field looked workable. It amounted to the same thing, he said. You showed up and you changed everything. The seed grain changed everything, she said, the practical Olive, the sensible one. No, he said quietly. You did. She looked at him across the table and said nothing for a moment, and then she said, Samuel, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly. Always, he said. What do you want, she said. From this, from us. What is it that you are thinking when you think about the future? He did not hesitate. I want to marry you, he said. I have been wanting to say that for 2 months. I want to combine the claims, yours and mine, and work them together, and build something bigger than either of us could build alone. And I want to spend the rest of my life having supper with you and finding out what else you know about mules. She looked at him very steadily. That is a clear answer, she said. I'm a clear man, he said. When it matters. I need more time, she said. Not because I do not want those things. I am telling you now that I want them too, or I would not have brought this up. But Robert has been gone 7 months, and I do not want to do anything that dishonors what he was. I would not ask you to, he said. Take the time you need. You are not impatient, she said. I have been farming this land for 2 years, he said. I know how to wait for something to ripen. She smiled, and it was the full smile, and it was aimed entirely at him. I will need until winter, she said, until the harvest is in and settled. Then I will know. Until winter, he said. They shook hands across the table, which made them both laugh, because it was such an Olive Langley thing to do, to seal an understanding with a handshake, and the laughter was warm and easy and filled the cabin entirely. The harvest came in September, and it was good. Not extraordinary, not the kind of harvest that makes men rich, but solid and honest, the kind of harvest that means survival and the possibility of next year. The south field yielded more than Samuel had dared project, 38 bushels per acre on decent soil with decent rain and Olive's good seed. And the corn on her claim was in before the first cold, stacked and stored in her crib. And the kitchen gardens of both claims had produced enough to fill the root cellar, and the shelves with preserved goods that would see them through the winter comfortably. Samuel took the wheat into Guthrie by wagon, 2 loads, and sold it at the grain elevator, and the money he came back with was more than he had seen in one sum since coming to the territory, and he paid Olive her 40% with the satisfaction of a man who has kept his word, and she took it with equal satisfaction, because it represented not charity but honest exchange. He also paid off his account at Harlan Creek's store, in full, which gave him a pleasure that was almost physical, and he bought Cedar a measure of proper oats because the mule deserved it. The day after the harvest was fully in, on a cool September evening with the smell of autumn in the air and the first geese going over in long wavering lines against the pale sky, Samuel drove his wagon to Olive's claim and found her on the porch watching the geese, and he climbed down and stood at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at her. The harvest is in, he said. It is, she said. You said winter, he said. I said until the harvest was in and settled, she said. And she looked at him for a long moment, and the geese went over with their thin, distant calling, and the evening light was the amber light of September that makes the whole world look like something worth keeping, and Olive Langley said, Yes, Samuel Malone. Yes, to which part, he said, because he needed to be sure. To all of it, she said, all of it. He climbed the 2 steps and took both her hands in his, and she looked up at him with her river water eyes that were clear and certain and warm, and he kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and she leaned into him with the wholeness of a person who has decided something fully and does not intend to revisit the decision. "I want to be married before the cold sets in," she said against his chest. "How long before?" "October," she said, "before it gets too cold for people to travel." "October," he said. "I will go to Reverend Potts in Duster's Ford tomorrow." "Samuel," she said. "Yes." "I am glad I drove up to your fence post," she said. "So am I," he said. "More than you know." "Tell me," she said. "That morning," he said, "I had just driven the last post in, and I was standing there thinking that I had run out of road, that the dream was done and I just hadn't sat down yet. And then I heard your wagon and I looked up and I saw you coming down the trace road like you owned the sky above it, and I thought." He paused. "What?" she said. "I thought, whoever that is, they are not afraid of this country," he said. "And I had been afraid of it for months, though I would not have said so, and seeing someone who was not afraid of it reminded me that I was not afraid of it either, not really, not deep down. I had just forgot." She pulled back to look at him. "I was afraid of it," she said. "I was afraid every day. But you got up every day and drove your wagon and hauled your seed grain and knocked on strangers' fence posts," he said. "That is not the absence of fear. That is the correct use of it." She was quiet for a moment. "Robert used to say something like that," she said. "He would have liked you." "I hope so," Samuel said. She squeezed his hands. "He would have liked that you are honest about things," she said. "He valued honesty above almost everything." "It is not very hard to be honest when you are not trying to be anything other than what you are," Samuel said. "It is harder than you think," she said. "You are just good at it." They were married in October, the 12th of October, 1889, in Duster's Ford, in the front room of Reverend Potts's home, which doubled as a meeting house on Sundays, with Cyrus Webb and his wife Martha as witnesses and Harlan Creek present, because he had a genuine interest in the occasion, and also because Samuel owed him a kind of debt for sending Olive his way, however indirectly, and also because Harlan Creek never missed a significant occasion in Duster's Ford if he could help it. Olive wore a dress of dark green wool that she had brought from Iowa, and which she said she had been saving, though for what she had not known until now, and she stood beside Samuel in front of Reverend Potts with her hands folded, and her spine straight and her eyes clear, and she said her vows in a voice that was steady and entirely sure. Samuel said his in a voice that was rougher with feeling than he intended, because standing in front of Reverend Potts and making these promises to Olive Langley was one of the most significant things he had ever done, and he felt the significance of it in every part of him. When Reverend Potts pronounced them married, Martha Webb made a small sound of pleased approval, and Harlan Creek shook Samuel's hand with an enthusiasm that suggested he felt he had had some part in it, and Cyrus Webb kissed Olive on the cheek with the gentle propriety of a man who has been looking out for someone and is happy to see them well settled, and Olive received it all with the composed warmth that was her way of being in the world. Samuel and Olive drove home together in her wagon, the two horses pulling steadily through the October afternoon, and the Oklahoma sky was vast and blue overhead, and the grass was turning gold, and the cottonwoods along the creek were going yellow in the way they do in autumn, all yellow at once like they cannot wait to be beautiful, and Samuel Malone felt an interior spaciousness that he had never quite felt before. As if the previous 2 years of difficulty had compressed something in him, and now it was expanding back to its proper size, filling out into the shape of a man who has what he needs. "Well," Olive said, driving. "Well," he said. "This is different," she said. "Yes," he said. "Better," she said, not as a question. "Better," he agreed, absolutely. They combined the claims in the practical way, which meant that Samuel spent the winter moving his essential belongings to her cabin, which was larger and better built, and letting his own cabin serve as the hired hand quarters for the following season, when they would have the labor to do something serious with both parcels. Cedar and Ruth's replacement. A young cow Samuel had bought in Guthrie with some of the harvest money, and named Ruth II, because he was not an imaginative man with names, settled into Olive's larger barn with her 2 horses in a state of general equine sociability. The winter of 1889 into 1890 was hard the way Oklahoma winters are always hard, with cold and wind, and the particular relentlessness of a season that does not care whether you are comfortable. But they were warm in the 2-room cabin, and there was enough food on the shelves and enough wood cut and stacked on the porch. And they spent the long evenings in lamplight doing the things that people do in winter when the outdoors is hostile and the indoors is warm. Olive sowed and mended and planned next year's garden with the careful ambition of a woman who thinks several seasons ahead. Samuel read to her from the 2 books he owned, a farming almanac and a collection of essays by a man named Thoreau that his teacher in Claiborne County had given him when he was 15, and Olive listened and occasionally argued with Thoreau's propositions with a sharpness that Thoreau would probably have respected. They talked. They talked more than Samuel had talked in his entire adult life. About everything. About the land and the territory and what it was becoming. About the rights of the settlers who had been here before either of them arrived. The Seminole and Muskogee nations whose land had been reduced and constrained by treaty after treaty, until the Oklahoma Territory itself was essentially the remainder of a dispossession that stretched back generations. Which was an injustice that sat on Samuel uncomfortably, because he had benefited from it in the simple act of filing his homestead claim. And he said so to Olive one evening, and she looked at him with a serious expression and said she thought about it. 2, that the land was beautiful and she wanted to love it without guilt, but the guilt was there regardless, and that the honest thing was to acknowledge it rather than paper over it. We can try to be good stewards, she said, and good neighbors to everyone around us, all of them. That is all we can do. It is not enough, he said. No, she agreed. It is not, but it is what we can do, so we do it. It was the most honest conversation he had ever had about that particular thing, and it was one of the 1,000 reasons he loved her. Spring came again, the spring of 1890, and with it the expansion of everything. They hired a young man named William Derry, a 22-year-old from Missouri who had come to the territory with nothing and needed work and had honest eyes. And William turned out to be an excellent farmhand with a particular gift for caring for animals that made Cedar and the horses all quietly devoted to him. They put the south field in winter wheat again, with seed from the previous year's harvest, their own seed now, saved and stored properly through the winter. They planted the north field in sorghum, which Olive suggested after reading an article in a farming journal she had borrowed from Martha Webb, who subscribed to 3 publications and shared them liberally. They expanded the kitchen garden to twice its previous size, building a proper fence around it to discourage the jackrabbits that were the constant cheerful enemies of every kitchen garden in the territory. And in the particular mercy of an April morning, Olive came to find Samuel in the barn where he was helping William repair a harness, and she stood in the barn doorway with the morning light behind her and said, with the straightforward composure that was entirely her, "I believe we are going to have a baby." Samuel set down the harness. He looked at her and she looked at him, and her face was composed in the way it always was, but her eyes were doing something he had not seen in them before, which was a kind of overwhelmed brightness, like sunlight on water, and he crossed the barn in 3 steps and took her face in his hands. "Are you sure?" he said. "Reasonably," she said. "I will be more sure in another month." "How do you feel?" "Somewhat nauseous in the mornings," she said. "Otherwise well." She paused. "Are you?" She stopped. "Tell me what you were going to say," he said. "Are you happy about it?" She said, and for the first time since he had known her, he heard something uncertain in her voice, something that was almost vulnerable in the way that things we most want are always slightly vulnerable when we bring them to the air. He pulled her to him and held her with the full extent of what he felt, which was large and warm and absolutely certain. "Olive," he said against her hair, "I am so happy about it, I do not have words for it, and I am not a man who is typically at a loss for words." She laughed against his chest, and he felt the laugh in his ribs. "You are not very talkative, actually," she said. "I am talkative with you," he said. "Which is the only place that matters." William Derry, who had witnessed this exchange from 3 feet away with the stoic discretion of a young man doing his very best not to be present, cleared his throat carefully and said, "Congratulations, ma'am, sir," and then became very absorbed in the harness. The baby came in November. It was a boy, born on the 8th of November, 1890, in the bedroom of the 2-room cabin with Martha Webb attending as she had attended half the births in the Dusters Ford area in her time, competent and calm, and exactly the sort of person you want beside you when the world is reorganizing itself. Samuel was not permitted in the room, which was the convention, and he sat on the porch in the November cold for 3 hours and listened to the sounds from inside with an intensity of attention that he had never applied to anything, not to fields or mules or weather, because there was nothing in his experience that had required this quality of focused, helpless waiting. He prayed in the general direction of the sky, which was something he did rarely and only when the stakes were high enough to require it, and the November sky was gray and indifferent the way sky is, and he prayed anyway because there was nothing else to do. Martha Webb opened the door at last and said, "Come in, Samuel. Mother and son are both well." He stood up so fast he nearly fell off the step. Olive was propped against the pillows in the lamplight, pale and tired in the specific way of a person who has done something enormously physical and is on the far side of it. And in her arms was a very small, very red, very serious-looking person who was approximately 1 hour old and was regarding the world with the skeptical gravity of someone who is not yet sure this was a good idea. Samuel sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at his wife and his son and felt something break open in him completely, not in the painful way things break, but in the way a seed case breaks when the seed inside has grown large enough to need more room. "He is serious-looking," he managed. "He is," Olive agreed. Her voice was tired and warm and completely real. "He looks like he has opinions." "He gets that from you," Samuel said. She looked at him with her river water eyes, which were also tired and warm and absolutely true. "What do you want to name him?" she said. They had discussed names for months. They had a list. Samuel looked at his son, who was small and red and somehow already entirely himself. "James," he said. "James Robert Malone," he glanced at her, "if you agree, for your husband." Olive was quiet for a moment and he saw her throat move. "Yes," she said. "Yes, that is exactly right." James Robert Malone opened his eyes, which were unfocused and deep blue the way all new eyes are, and seemed to be taking a general inventory of his new circumstances, and seemed on balance to find them acceptable. "He looks like he approves," William Derry said from the doorway, where he had appeared at some point with his hat in his hands and a look of genuine delight on his young face. "He approves," Samuel said. The years built themselves one on the next the way honest years do, each one adding to the structure of what had been started in that spring of 1889, when Olive Langley drove her wagon down the Trace Road with seed grain and a business proposition, and changed the entire architecture of Samuel Malone's life. By 1892, the South Field and the North Field together were yielding consistently, not in the extravagant way of the land further east, but solidly and reliably, and they had paid off the claim debt and had money in the Guthrie Bank that was not $14 in a tobacco tin, but a real account with real numbers in it that grew a little each year. The combined claims, all 320 acres of them, were registered in both their names with the land office, which required a small amount of administrative persistence, but which Samuel managed with the same stubborn efficiency he applied to everything. Cedar the mule, who was aging with the graceful stubbornness of a good animal, was semi-retired by 1892, allowed to graze and be fed good oats, and not asked to do more than he wanted to do. They had 2 proper draft horses now, and a younger mule William Derry had bought at auction in Guthrie, and named something that was his business. Cedar regarded the younger mule with the equanimity of a creature who has earned his rest. James Robert grew from the serious red infant into a serious brown-haired boy of 2, and then 3, who had his mother's direct gaze and his father's persistent stubbornness, and was, according to Martha Webb, who had an extensive reference collection of children, about the most self-possessed child she had ever seen, which is either a blessing or something to watch carefully. Samuel thought it was a blessing. He watched his son walk through the farmyard with the careful, observant attention of a small person learning the world, crouching to look at beetles, following Cedar to the water trough, standing in the south field with the wheat around him and looking at it with a concentrated interest that made Samuel's throat go tight. "He is going to love this land," Samuel told Olive one evening. "He already does," she said. "He told me this morning that the wheat smells good." "He is right," Samuel said. "It does." She was sitting beside him in the evening that had softened to late summer gold, and she was quieter than usual, which he had learned to read as something internal happening rather than unhappiness. "What is it?" he said. "I am thinking about next year," she said. "What about next year?" She looked at him sideways and he saw the almost smile, the one he had been learning since March of 1889, the one that still did things to him after 3 years of marriage that a smile had no right to do to a sensible man. "Another baby," she said. He looked at her. She was composed and warm and entirely sure, which was how she was about things she had thought through properly. "When?" he said. "April," she said, "give or take." He reached over and took her hand and she let him, which was one of his great pleasures always, Olive Langley letting him take her hand. "Good," he said. "You are not going to be more expressive than that," she said. "I am extremely happy," he said, in a deep and genuine way that I would describe more elaborately, but you would tell me it was excessive. "I would not," she said. "You would." "I might," she admitted. The second child was a daughter, born in March of 1893, which was close enough to April for practical purposes, and Olive named her Clara because it had been her mother's name, and Samuel agreed immediately and wholeheartedly. And Clara came into the world in considerably less dramatic fashion than James had, as if she had already understood the general mechanism and just needed to be pointed in the right direction. She was a different creature from her brother from the first. Where James was serious and observant, Clara was loud and definite and gave her opinions about everything, including things she could not yet possibly have opinions about, which made Martha Webb laugh and say, "This one is going to be a handful, and I mean that as a compliment." James regarded his new sister with the serious interest of a 3-year-old encountering something unprecedented, and then said, with great deliberateness, "She is loud," which was the most accurate assessment anyone offered. "She is," Olive agreed. "I was not loud," James said. "You were very quiet," his mother confirmed. "Better," he said, satisfied, and went back to whatever he had been doing. Samuel held Clara in the lamplight that first evening while Olive slept, which she had earned absolutely, and the baby looked at him with the unfocused gravity of a person who has just arrived somewhere new and is not yet sure what to make of it. "Hello, Clara," he said. "This is the place. It is harder than you will think it should be sometimes, and better than you will expect at other times, and there are people here who will love you completely, which is the most important part." Clara made a small sound that might have been agreement and went to sleep. The spring of 1893 was also the year William Derry, who had worked for them for 3 years and had grown into an excellent and reliable young man, met a woman in Guthrie named Agnes who sold dry goods in her family store, and was, in William's somewhat overwhelmed assessment, the most remarkable person he had ever encountered. And he came to Samuel and Olive in early summer with his hat in his hands, and announced that he was going to ask her to marry him, and did they think he should? Olive said yes, ask her immediately, you are not going to find better. Samuel said yes, but be sure she knows what she is agreeing to, because farming is not a soft life. William said he had told her everything, and she had said she knew exactly what she was agreeing to and was agreeing anyway. Olive said that settled it. William Derry and Agnes married in August, and William continued to work the Malone claim through the following year, while he and Agnes saved enough to file on a parcel of their own, which they did in 1895. And Samuel helped him build his first cabin, and Olive gave Agnes seeds from the kitchen garden, and the whole thing had a quality of continuation and rightness, like one good thing producing another. By the autumn of 1895, with James a sturdy and serious 5-year-old who already followed Samuel through the fields asking careful questions about everything, and Clara, a wild and cheerful 2-year-old who had already learned that the fastest way from one place to another was through rather than around any obstacle, Samuel Malone stood at the edge of the south field on a September evening and looked at the wheat standing golden and heavy-headed in the last light. And Olive stood beside him the way she did at the end of most days, close enough that their shoulders touched, and the field stretched out around them in the amber September air, all of it theirs, all of it earned. "Do you remember what you told me?" she said. "That morning you drove the last fence post in and thought you were at the end of everything." "You were not there that morning," he said. "You told me about it," she said, "in July, when you told me about thinking about giving up." "I remember," he said. "I said I had run out of road. And then I came," she said. "And then you came," he said, "with a wagon full of seed grain and told me to move over." She leaned against him very slightly, which was her particular language for affection, the subtle lean, the quiet presence. "I did not tell you to move over," she said. "It amounted to the same thing," he said. "The field looked workable," she said. "And was it?" he said. "Was it workable?" She turned and looked at him, and the light was the gold September light, and her eyes were river water gray-green, and her face was a little more weathered by the years and entirely beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are real and true and yours, and she said, "It was the best field I ever planted." He put his arm around her, and they stood together looking at what they had made out of a desperate spring morning, a wagon-load of seed grain, a cracked clay field, a mule with a bad leg, a business proposition, and the specific and irreplaceable thing that had grown between them out of proximity and honesty and the shared work of hard years. James came across the yard toward them at a run, because at 5 he ran everywhere, and Cedar looked up from the fence line where the old mule was grazing in the last of the September sun, and Clara's voice could be heard from the cabin demanding something with the cheerful persistence of a child who expects the world to respond. And the geese were going over in their long lines against the pale sky, and the evening was coming down with the first suggestion of autumn cool. And the wheat stood golden and full and ready in the south field, and there was wood cut and stacked for the winter, and food on the shelves, and money in the bank in Guthrie, and the graves of Robert Langley and Samuel's own past failures and Olive's long season of grief were all behind them now, honored and acknowledged and allowed to be what they were, part of the ground on which everything living had taken root. James reached them and skidded to a stop and looked up at his father and said, with the serious deliberateness he applied to all important communications, "The corn in the north field is ready." "I know," Samuel said. "We will start harvesting it tomorrow." "Can I help?" "You always help," Samuel said. James considered this and seemed satisfied. He looked at the south field. "The wheat is ready too," he said. "Next week," Samuel said. "It smells good," James said, which was what he always said about the wheat, which still made Samuel's throat go tight every time. "It does," he agreed. James ran back toward the barn where Cedar was standing, because Cedar was the great love of James Malone's short life, and had been since the boy was old enough to walk on his own, and the old mule turned his great head and regarded the running child with the ancient patience of a creature who has weathered grasshoppers and hard winters and a lame foreleg and still finds the mornings good. Olive watched her son run and then turned back to the field. "Samuel," she said. "Yes." "I want to add on to the cabin this winter," she said. "Another room. James and Clara need separate spaces. They are at each other constantly," and she paused. He turned to look at her. She had her composed expression, but her eyes had that overwhelmed brightness again, the sunlight on water brightness, the brightness he had first seen in the barn doorway in April of 1890 when she told him about James. "Another room," he said slowly. "A larger room," she said, "to be practical about it." "How practical do we need to be?" he said. "Very practical," she said, "by next June." He looked at her and she looked at him, and the evening air was warm and golden, and the wheat was in the field, and the children were alive and loud and real, and the whole accumulated weight of the life they had built together was there in the yard around them, solid and true. He kissed her. Not a brief kiss, a real one, the kind that says everything that words are too small for, and she kissed him back with the wholeness she brought to everything she did fully. And James yelled something from the barn that neither of them caught, and Clara's demanding voice from the cabin reached a new register of persistence. And Cedar the mule made a sound that was probably unrelated to all of this, but sounded, in context, like approval. When they finally stepped back from each other, Olive smoothed her hair with a composure that was only slightly undermined by the fact that she was smiling the full smile, the real one, the one that changed her face. "I should see to Clara," she said. "I will get James," he said. "Samuel," she said. "Yes. This was a good field," she said. "It was a very good field." He looked at the south field one more time, in the last of the September light, the wheat gold and full and waiting, and he thought about a March morning 2 years before any of this, when he had driven a fence post into the cracked earth, and thought he was at the end of everything. And he thought about the sound of a wagon coming from the east with the purpose of someone who knows where they are going. And a woman who stepped down into the dust of his yard and said move over without saying it in so many words, and planted a seed in the dead ground of his failed dream that turned out to be the most important thing anyone had ever planted anywhere. "The best field I ever had," he said, and meant all of it. The wheat and the years and the life and the woman and the children and the morning and the evening and everything in between. He turned from the field and walked toward the cabin where his daughter was conducting her small and passionate argument with the general universe, and Olive walked beside him with her shoulder against his arm, and the September evening came down warm and gold and full around them, and above the prairie, the first stars were finding their places one by one in the darkening sky, and everything was exactly as it should be, and nothing was left undone.